The most decorated cardiac surgeon in Toronto was standing in the snow outside a liquor store on Bloor Street, pretending he had somewhere important to be. Malcolm Forde had spent 22 years putting his hands inside people's chests and making their hearts begin again. He had trained at McGill, operated at Toronto General, been photographed for Maclean's twice, and had his name etched into a research wing of sick kids that other doctors' children would grow up walking past without knowing it. He had a house in Forest Hill with 7 rooms he no longer entered. He had a voice that had once stopped bleeding and saved lives just by staying calm. His son had been dead for 2 years and 3 months, and not one of those things meant anything at all. Kieran, 8 years old. A cardiac event during a routine tonsillectomy that no one had predicted and no one had caught in time because Malcolm was giving a keynote address in Vancouver when the anesthesiologist paged him too late. He had landed at Pearson at 11:52 p.m. His son was gone by midnight. His wife Renata had tried to hold them together for 11 months. Then she couldn't anymore, and Malcolm didn't blame her. He had been barely present even before she left. He had learned how to stand in a room and look like a person without being one. That February evening, wind cutting off Lake Ontario sharp enough to sting, he was walking back from the store with nothing in the paper bag, except a bottle of scotch he hadn't needed, and a silence so complete it had its own weight. The street lamps turned the snow gold. The sidewalks on Bloor were crowded with people ducking in and out of warmth, collars up, scarves tight, living the way people do when they have something to go home to. Then a girl came sprinting out of a side street so fast she couldn't stop herself. She hit Malcolm hard enough to knock the bag sideways. Her hands shot out and grabbed fistfuls of his coat. He looked down. She was maybe 10 years old. Her hair was dark and loose, plastered wet to her face. Her coat was enormous on her. Some kind of gray institutional thing 2 sizes too large, the sleeves flopping past her knuckles. Her sneakers were soaked through. Her eyes, brown wide, already carrying a kind of exhaustion that didn't belong in a child's face, went straight to his hands. "Please," she said. Her voice was barely air. "Are you a doctor?" Malcolm stared at her. "Your hands," she said, still holding his coat, still looking at his hands with the specific urgency of someone who had been watching for something like this. "I can tell from your hands, please. My brother can't breathe right. He's been bad since this afternoon, and the night staff didn't come for 20 minutes last time. And I don't know what to do and nobody will." "Hey." A man in a gray uniform was jogging toward them from the direction the girl had come, his boots slapping through the slush. Ava, stop right there." The girl pressed herself against Malcolm's arm, not sideways. Hard in, the way children press into something when they are not just afraid but bracing. Malcolm's body made the decision before his mind finished catching up. He put his arm around her shoulders. "She's with me," he said. The man in the uniform slowed. He was maybe 40, heavyset, his ID badge catching the streetlight. It read Rosemont Children's Center. He looked at Malcolm, at the coat Malcolm was wearing, at the particular way expensive wool sits on a man who has worn it for decades. "Sir, this child is a resident under our supervision. She's not." "She ran into me and turned her ankle," Malcolm said. His voice had not changed. "Surgeons learn early that the voice is a tool. I was just asking her if she needed help." The man hesitated. The girl didn't move. "Give her a moment," Malcolm said. Not loudly, but with the tone that had once made junior residents stop mid-sentence in an operating theater. The man stopped. It lasted only 30 seconds, long enough for Malcolm to crouch so he was level with her face, his hand still on her shoulder, and to look at her directly. "Is your brother at Rosemont?" She nodded. "How old?" 7. "What happens when he can't breathe?" "He goes gray. His lips go gray around the edges and he counts my fingers because he says it helps him remember to slow down." Her voice broke on the last 2 words and she forced it back. "I know that sounds stupid, but he can't do it by himself yet." Malcolm stood. "Thank you," he said to the man in the uniform, in the voice that meant the conversation was over. "I'll walk her back." He walked the girl to a coffee shop, sat her in a booth by the window, and ordered her a hot chocolate. She wrapped both hands around without drinking for a long time. Then, she told him everything. Her name was Ava Tran. Her brother was Luca, 7 years old, severe asthma since he was 4. Their mother Pauline had died 8 months ago. Ovarian cancer, quick and brutal, diagnosed in April and finished by October. No father in the picture, no aunt or uncle close enough or willing enough. Rosemont Children's Center had seemed, according to the Children's Aid Society worker who processed their intake, like a good match. Safe. Well-reviewed, government contracted. "Luca has a prescription," Ava said. "A blue inhaler, but they keep it at the nurse's station, and sometimes when he needs it at night, it takes a long time for someone to come. And last week he woke up and I wasn't in the room because they'd moved me to a different dormitory, and by the time I got there his lips were going gray and he was counting by himself. Just counting. Nothing." Malcolm had his hands flat on the table. They said he was fine, they wrote in the log that he was fine, but I was there, I saw him. Do you know what medication he's on, what it's called? She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. She had written it down. The medication name, the dosage, the frequency. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. A child who understood that details mattered. Malcolm looked at the dosage number. Something went very still in him. The number was too low, not by a little, by a margin that, in a 7-year-old boy with severe asthma, was the difference between management and crisis. He asked 3 more questions. She answered each one precisely, clearly, without exaggeration. She was not performing, she was reporting. When she finished, she looked at him across the table and said, I don't need you to fix everything. I just need someone to look at him who knows what they're seeing. Malcolm drove her back to Rosemont himself. He asked to speak with the director. Brenda Sutcliffe met him in the front lobby at 8:30, with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to use pleasantness as a barrier. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, trim with the kind of measured smile that never quite reached her eyes. She thanked him for returning Ava safely. She said Ava had a history of anxiety that manifested as what she called crisis-seeking behavior. She said Luca's care plan was fully compliant with provincial guidelines. Malcolm had spent 22 years reading people the way other men read weather. He asked one question. May I see the boy? Brenda Sutcliffe's smile did not move, but the air around it changed. That's not standard procedure for non-family members. I'm a physician, Malcolm said. I'm not asking to treat him, I'm asking to observe. His care team is fully qualified. I don't doubt that. Then there should be nothing concerning to see. She showed him in. Luca was small for 7. He sat a cot in the medical room with his knees pulled up, watching a cartoon on a tablet with the sound off. When Malcolm came through the door, the boy's eyes went first to the frame, then to Ava behind Malcolm, and something in his whole body, shoulders, jaw, hands, unlocked like a key turning. He raised one hand and started counting Ava's fingers. She let him. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he took a breath that was audibly tight, the kind of breath that arrives with effort. Malcolm listened. Not with a stethoscope. He hadn't carried one in 2 years, but he had spent 2 decades learning to hear what most people couldn't. The exhale was too long. The muscles between the ribs were working. The prescription Ava had written down was not a clerical error. It was a pattern. He turned to Brenda Sutcliffe. How long has he been on this dosage? Since admission. And in 8 months, it hasn't been reviewed. He's had no hospitalizations. Because his sister has been monitoring him, Malcolm said quietly. Not because his lungs are improving. Brenda Sutcliffe looked at him the way powerful people look at inconvenient facts. With patience that was really dismissal in a better suit. Dr. Forde, I appreciate your concern, but we've operated this facility for 14 years without. Thank you for letting me see him, Malcolm said. He left, but he did not stop. His former attorney, Carolyn Tate, met him for breakfast the next morning at a diner on Queen Street, listened to everything without writing a single note, and then put down her coffee. If the dosage is what you're saying, and there's a documented pattern of delayed response to respiratory events, that's not just negligence. That's billable misconduct under the provincial care standard. I know. You've been out of medicine for 2 years. My license is still active. He had renewed it without thinking, the way you renew a habit you are not ready to fully end. Carolyn looked at him for a moment. Malcolm, why are you doing this? He didn't answer immediately. Outside, a streetcar rumbled past, throwing a brief orange glow across the diner window. Because a 10-year-old girl wrote down a medication name on a piece of paper and carried it in her coat pocket, in case she found someone who could help, he said. Because she didn't ask me to save her. She asked me to look at her brother. Carolyn picked up her pen. The formal visit request was denied. The children's aid referral went into a queue. Then Ava called him from the payphone in the Rosemont common room on a Thursday afternoon. They separated us. Her voice was flat in the way voices go flat when there is nothing left to spend on panic. They moved Luca to the residential medical wing. They said it's for monitoring, but they won't let me go during visiting hours because we're not assigned to the same unit anymore. Malcolm closed his eyes. They said it's temporary, Ava said. But they said a lot of things were temporary. He went back that afternoon with Carolyn, and a colleague from the Provincial College of Physicians, who owed him a professional courtesy, and was willing to call it a welfare assessment. What the assessment found was this. In 14 months of operation under the current administration, Rosemont had logged 63 respiratory events, across a population of chronically ill children. Of those, 41 had been resolved without escalation to emergency services. Of those 41, 37 involved children whose prescribed dosages had been adjusted downward upon admission, not upward, as clinical protocol required for children coming from unsupervised home environments. The adjustments had been signed off by a consulting physician named Dr. Raymond Ouellette, who held contracts with 6 provincial care facilities and billed the Ministry of Children and Family Services approximately 4 times per child per year for reviews that took, on average, 11 minutes. Brenda Sutcliffe had not been making mistakes. She had been making money. Malcolm sat across from Brenda Sutcliffe in her office and placed the assessment summary on her desk. She didn't look at it. "Dr. Forde, you are here without appointment and without authorization, and I'm going to have to ask." "Raymond Ouellette has been billing the ministry for medication reviews he did not conduct," Malcolm said. "The adjusted dosages across your medical cohort represent a systematic under-treatment pattern. Luca Tran's lung function has declined measurably since admission. When I testify to that before the college, and I will testify to that before the college, the question they will ask is not whether you knew. The question will be whether you could have not known." Brenda Sutcliffe's face did not move. She was very good at this. The stillness of someone who had rehearsed every version of this conversation, and was trying to locate which one she was in. "Children with complex medical needs require careful cost management," she said at last, in the tone of someone reciting a policy document. "Our mandate is to serve the broadest population." "Ava Tran has been acting as her brother's primary medical monitor since the day they arrived here," Malcolm said. "She is 10 years old. She wrote down his medication name and dosage and carried it in her coat pocket in case she found someone on the street who could help him. That is not a care plan. That is a child raising herself because every adult around her decided he was too complicated to bother with." Something crossed Brenda Sutcliffe's face. Not shame, not yet. Something older and harder. The expression of a person who has told themselves a story for long enough that the story has calcified into something they cannot see past anymore. "Children like Ava," she said carefully, "have a tendency to construct narratives." "She is not a narrative," Malcolm said. "She is a little girl who hasn't slept a full night in 8 months, because she's been listening for her brother's breathing." He left the assessment on her desk. Then he called everyone, whose number was still in his phone. By Monday, Carolyn had filed for emergency medical reassessment and temporary protective placement. A colleague at Sick Kids conducted a full pulmonary assessment of Luca. The results confirmed what Malcolm had expected and hoped not to. The boy's lung function had deteriorated by nearly 20% since admission. With appropriate medication, the decline was reversible. Without intervention, it would not remain so. Dr. Raymond Ouellette, when interviewed by the provincial college, said he had signed the adjusted dosage reviews based on Brenda Sutcliffe's verbal summaries of the children's conditions. He had not examined them personally. He said this in the voice of a man who had been sitting with that truth for some time and was relieved in the way of the cowardly to finally put it down somewhere. 2 nurses who had worked overnight shifts at Rosemont for 3 years gave statements to the ministry investigator. They described being told not to escalate respiratory events to emergency services unless the child lost consciousness, because escalations affected the facility's reported outcome scores, which affected the government contract rating. The Toronto Star ran the story on a Wednesday morning. By noon, 3 other families had contacted Carolyn's office. By evening, the ministry had suspended Rosemont's contract pending full review. Brenda Sutcliffe's photograph was on the front page the next day, taken outside the provincial buildings. She looked smaller than she had in her office. The stillness was entirely gone. The placement hearing was held on a Thursday in late March, when the snow was beginning to soften at the edges, and the city was starting to remember that warmth was possible. Judge Marie-France Beausoleil had the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades listening to people explain why children were less important than paperwork. She reviewed the file, she heard the assessments, and then she looked up. Dr. Ouellette was present. He sat near the wall with his hands folded and did not look up for most of the proceeding. When the judge asked him to confirm the assessment record, he confirmed it. When she asked him to confirm he had not examined the children personally, he confirmed that as well. His voice was level. His hands were not. Ava watched him from across the table. She didn't say anything. She just watched with those eyes that were too steady for a 10-year-old. And the steadiness was more devastating than anything she could have said out loud. At the end of the proceeding, Judge Beausoleil looked at Malcolm over her reading glasses. "Dr. Forde, you're seeking to be approved as temporary custodial placement for both children, pending the full adoption assessment process." "Yes," Malcolm said. "Your professional background, financial standing, and the ministry assessment all support the application." She paused. "You've also been largely removed from your professional and personal life for the better part of 2 years." "That's accurate," he said. "What's changed?" Malcolm looked at Ava. She was watching him with an expression that was not quite hope. Hope was too fragile a word for what lived in her face. It was more like the look of someone standing at the edge of a door they have been burned by before, deciding whether to step through it one more time. He thought of Kieran. He thought of how his son used to count ceiling tiles when he was nervous. A habit no one had ever explained and Malcolm had never thought to ask about, and now never could. A child I had never met trusted me enough to ask for help, he said. I'd like to be worth that. The judge looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at Luca. Luca, she said gently, do you understand what we're talking about today? Luca, who had been very quiet through the entire proceeding in the careful way of children who have learned that being quiet keeps things from going wrong, looked up. He considered the question with the gravity of someone for whom answers had always mattered and rarely come. It means we go home with him, he said, and we don't have to leave. Judge Beausoleil glanced at Malcolm. Malcolm nodded once. Luca reached across the table and took Malcolm's hand. He started, 3, 4, 5. Then he took a full breath. Clear this time, unlabored, the kind of breath that sounds like something beginning, and he sat back and said simply, okay. The house in Forest Hill learned to have shoes by the door again. Ava took the room with the window seat overlooking the back garden, and immediately covered the sill with library books about marine biology, because she had decided at some point during the months at Rosemont that she was going to study the ocean. Luca took the room next to hers and made Malcolm promise 3 times in the first week that the rooms would stay next to each other. Malcolm kept the promise. He had learned, finally, that promises made to children were the ones that could not be broken carelessly. He went back to medicine in June, not to the operating theater. He was honest enough with himself to know that part of his life had a shape he was no longer able to hold. Instead, he opened a small clinic in Parkdale, funded out of his own money and a grant from a foundation run by an old colleague at McGill, offering free primary care and specialist referrals for children in provincial care. Every child who came in was examined by someone who took the time to actually sit with them. Every medication was reviewed against the child's actual body weight, actual history, actual needs. He hired 3 nurses, a social worker, a child psychologist named Dr. Susan Adeyemi, who had a gift for getting children to say out loud the things they had been carrying quietly. On the clinic's first day, Ava came with him. She sat at the front desk and organized intake forms with the seriousness of someone doing work that mattered, which it did. Luca sat beside her and counted ceiling tiles, and Malcolm watched him from across the room and thought, there it is. The same small private system children build to keep the world from becoming too large. He didn't interrupt it. He stood close enough that the boy would know where he was. That evening, driving home along the lakeshore with the windows cracked and the April air just beginning to turn soft, Ava said from the back seat, without looking up from her book, "Are you going to be a doctor forever now?" Malcolm thought about it. "I think I'm going to be your father forever," he said. "The doctor part is negotiable." Ava made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was close enough. In the seat beside her, Luca counted his own fingers, 1 through 5, and went to sleep. The city moved past the windows. Somewhere beneath it, the lake was doing what it always does, taking everything the winter had left behind, and slowly without fuss making room for something new. The lesson in all of it, Malcolm would come to understand, was not that wealth protects or that medicine saves. It was simpler and harder than either of those things. A child had run out into a February night in an oversized coat and found a man who had forgotten how to be inside a life. She had not asked him to give her everything. She had asked him to look. Sometimes looking is the whole thing. Sometimes the person who pulls you back from the cold is the one you thought you were warming. Never let a child's fear become someone else's problem. Never mistake a broken person for an empty one. Grief and love are made of the same material, and sometimes all it takes is a small hand reaching up to remind you which one you still have left.